Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, Professor of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I serve as the host of our program. Joining me today are our two regular commentators. We finally got the band back together. We did tape a show earlier, but Don wasn't able to be with us, so we're glad to have Don back with us. But first, let me introduce Denise Keele. Denise is a professor of political science at Western Michigan University. She's also involved with the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, and she serves as the chair of the WMU Working Group on Climate Change and also chairs the Kalamazoo Area Climate Crisis Coalition. So she's a rather busy person, does fantastic work. And again, Don Cooney is joining us today. And Don, we want to first of all congratulate you. Don was just elected back to the Kalamazoo City Commission.
Thank you, Ron.
A two-year hiatus to catch
Somebody
his breath.
said, "Man, you had a good judgment in being off those 2 years. Everything went wrong around COVID, and then the demonstrations in the streets and all."
Yeah. But anyway, Don is back on the city commission. Actually, elected vice mayor of the city, and so again, congratulations, Don, on being back. We really need you on the city commission, so we're glad that you're back there. Just a quick update, what's kind of on the agenda? What are your plans for this, the next, well, you're on for a 4-year term.
I got a 4-year term here, yeah. 2 years as what do you call it? Deputy Vice Mayor, yeah. Whatever I am. You know, I was watching for the last 2 years and really wanted to get more involved. And I tried to do that, but I couldn't really do it from the sidelines. We've got tremendous problems in the city. The most visible is the homeless situation, but we have a lot of problems with criminal justice and the violence that's taking place in the streets. The economic hardships that so many people are facing. I mean, the study that was done by the United Way that showed that if you put together the poverty rate plus the people that are working but aren't meeting their basic needs, it's over 50% in the city. And then the heritage of racism that we face in the city. And I think that our problems are manageable. I mean, if we were in New York or Philadelphia, where I worked before, those problems are huge, and these problems are manageable. And I think that this city has the resources to make an enormous difference in that. And I'm really thrilled about the people that were elected with me. I think Stephanie Hoffman is an expert on housing and has a passion for the issues that I was talking about. Esteban Juarez is a guy from the streets, tremendous asset helping us to understand from the bottom what's going on the streets. And then Kiana presents a different perspective, which I think will be really helpful to us. So I'm really excited about us really doing something.
Got a good team. David Anderson reelected as
David
mayor.
Reelected, yeah.
And so you're ready to tackle the difficult problems that our city faces.
That's right. That's right.
Well, again, we're just thrilled that you're back on the city commission. I think they sorely needed your insight, your passion, your wisdom, and so we're glad to have you back there.
Thank you.
And we're glad to have you back with us.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be here.
The last show, which Don couldn't attend, we had Professor Paul Clements with us, and we were talking about the Conference of Parties number 26, which was about to take place in Glasgow, Scotland. That conference has now been held, so the world came together in another attempt to try to deal with the climate crisis. And a lot of people felt that this was sort of a make or break kind of conference, and a follow-up to the Paris Agreement in 2015. So now, 6 years later, how are we doing? And a lot of expectations, and it did seem to kind of fizzle out. So I thought we'd get a quick update from Denise on her views on what happened in Glasgow.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Absolutely. A mixed bag, fairly disappointed. Greta says it best, as always, blah, 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 right? So The first thing I think I would say is there's still an immense emissions gap. So, right, we know that we're trying to meet that Paris target of 1.5, and countries are supposed to make their own individual contributions and decide how close they can get to reducing their emissions to get that. Pre-COP26, those contributions added up to still about 3.6, 3.8 degrees of warming, which is awful. And so there's, some would say, argue some success because the new contributions that folks came in with, 151 countries out of the 192, put up new contributions that if everybody did everything they said, gets us to 2.5. Which is still too high.
Still too
so,
high.
you know,
Still unacceptable.
There is a huge emissions gap. And again, that's if I do everything I said I was going to do. Now, I'm pretty good, but even I don't complete my list every day, right? So there's a lot that can go wrong. The other big thing I would point out is there's still a huge financing gap. There, you know, 5-10 years, 2009, Secretary Clinton, right, said we need $100 billion in order to provide adaptation because the developed countries who caused this need to support developing countries. The true climate justice comes to a fold in the accountability of the financing. We're, by the best accounting, the most generous figure, we've reached 80 billion. But most scholars say there's a ton of double counting going on. There's just, it goes through all these aid organizations and there's lots of corruption, and that's really probably closer to 50 billion. So only half of the funds necessary since 2009 have been raised. So emissions gap, financing gap, and I gotta say, the way that I frame this is also a credibility gap now. We did not do anything, none of these countries are doing anything actually strong enough to think about keeping those fossil fuels in the ground. They talked again about carbon markets, which would be great, and carbon tax, as we all know, is a great first step, and they worked on some of the rules there. But some of the other stuff is just all this little ad hoc stuff. And I say credibility gap because we're really trusting business is the big outcome of here. Right, I see your skepticism, mine as well. Okay, financial firms are supposed to be putting in climate risk, right? We're gonna try to stop some of those subsidies, we're gonna have a carbon tax, but that's relying all on the business and economic sector and those incentives to work properly. And we know how good, from Ron's own book, the fossil fuel industry is at obfuscating and not meeting those kinds of targets and making up for those things. The other big thing I would say, there was a coal pledge that 46 countries signed to eliminate coal, which the U.S. failed to also sign.
And India resisted.
And India also failed. So, you know.
And China and Russia didn't even send their national leaders to come to the conference.
That's exactly it. And so the environmental justice advocates are incredibly upset. You know, many indigenous peoples and the small island nation states didn't even get to send representatives. It was too expensive for them to get there. All of these things. But we allow fossil fuel companies to send about 500 delegates.
If you wanted to check delegations, the fossil fuel industry had the largest delegation, larger than any other nation.
That's right.
And that doesn't bode well.
It doesn't.
And again, they're engaged in this tremendous project of greenwashing right now.
That's exactly
it. They want to present to us that they've changed their tune, that they're in the game now, that they understand the issue, and they're going to do whatever they can. Well, I'm sorry, that's not true. They're just they're playing a fast one.
We know better.
Put a fast one on national governments. They're not doing what they need to do. And they're not being held accountable. And they can greenwash all they want, but actions speak louder than their greenwash ads, right?
That's exactly right.
And we don't see any actions that are commensurate with the problem.
And here we are another year in, and we're already at 1.1 degree of warming. Right? Every minute matters. It really absolutely does.
What's so striking?
Sorry, it's not better.
Right.
Despite big promises,
What's so striking to me is the lack of a sense of urgency on the part of people that got power to make policy decisions on this. And it's a lot of what we're facing in this country.
Correct.
The question of profit versus human rights. And profit is winning.
That's right.
And the struggle has to really be strong. And I'm just struck by what we saw immediately after that, as I was just saying before we started, about the flooding that's taken place in Canada, about the famines that are taking place where people can't grow crops anymore, the immigration where people are forced out there, and all that is pushed to the side, and just the money's what really counts.
Yeah, one other point I would mention, there's no discussion of climate migrants in
Right,
this,
that's
this
right.
year at all. It was absolutely taken off the table for reasons that still remain sort of unclear from the report. So we're not even going to discuss the folks and those impacts that are happening that we know are going to be moving. Like, doesn't even come up.
And there are immediate crises all over
right.
the world regarding climate migration.
That's
I mean,
right.
one only has to look to what's
Yeah.
happening on the border between Belarus and Poland.
That's
Right.
Let alone the border between Mexico and the United States and
That's right.
Other parts of the
over the
Mediterranean.
place.
Yep.
And so,
Rockies.
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
just. Well, we'll certainly be talking more about this. Denise and I are involved with a project on campus to continually focus on the climate crisis, and the city's got a climate action plan that's moving forward.
Yes.
We heard from them last week at
That's
the
right.
Climate Crisis Coalition.
Right.
So all three of us will still be very much involved in
Absolutely.
bringing this issue back.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing, Ron. I was really impressed by youth, the young
Yes.
people that were there, and so strong and so clear in their analysis. I just thought that was great.
So that's the hope.
Yes,
That's the one
hope.
hope, that
That's right.
that movement of young people, very strong, very
Yep.
informed, and dedicated.
That's
to
right. We
this
got to
issue.
do everything we can to support that social movement and
That's right.
help those young people see a future.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, so far today we've talked a little bit about democracy
Yeah.
at the local level,
Yeah.
and we've talked about, is it democracy at the international level? I'm not sure, but at least politics at the
sure.
international level. So what we really wanted to talk about today, to focus on for the rest of the program, is democracy at the nation-state level here in the United States.
Yeah.
And all three of us, I think, recognize a very clear threat to democracy in the United States. This should be a five-alarm fire bell that's ringing, and people are not tuned into it yet, I think. And so hopefully we can provide a little bit of analysis to alert people that your democracy is in grave danger
Yes.
right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
And it has been for some time, but the danger has increased dramatically
Yeah.
since the 2020 election.
Yeah.
Now, I think we have to start by going back to the 2020 election and the aftermath of it. Trump's refusal to concede, his lie after lie after lie. We've started to call it the big lie because it is one of the biggest lies that has ever been told in American political history. The lie that the election was stolen from Donald Trump, and that's completely untrue. That's completely false. It did not happen. There's absolutely no evidence anywhere, no evidence to support that,
right.
but the lie continues.
That's right.
And of course, that lie is corroding the political process because so many people do believe it. There's absolutely no evidence. I'm going to repeat this again. There is no evidence.
Yeah.
Over 60 lawsuits were filed. Every single court that's considered this issue, every state that has done a recount or an audit, there is absolutely no evidence that there was any fraud involved in this election. And yet this lie persists. And because of this lie, this now has undermined a number of a large group of Americans' faith in the electoral process,
Correct.
and it has opened the door for state legislatures now to do really bad things.
Yeah.
They were doing bad things before,
Correct.
but now they feel empowered, emboldened to do even more and more bad things, basically in an effort to steal the next election.
Absolutely.
I mean, let's put it right on the table.
Absolutely.
The Republican Party is planning to steal the 2022 election and the
Agreed.
2024 election. They're rigging the system in whatever way that they can to ensure that Republicans will be in power in the next Congress and in the 2024 presidential election. Now let's talk a little bit about how they're rigging the system, because they definitely are rigging it. Denise,
Sure.
where do you want to start on that?
I know it's exactly true, and we need to be saying exactly what we're saying over and over and over again. Republicans cannot win a free and fair election
Right.
based on their own party values and lines, and so their number one recourse is to rig those elections. We, of course, saw great gains in voter access. In 2018, think about what Michigan did, oh my gosh, in advance of the pandemic, to expand no excuse absentee and ballot boxes, and sending out our absentee procedures, right? Exactly, not the ballots, right? To work on gerrymandering in those districts. You saw all this progress and response to that, and then of course the big lie happens, and we have now seen 18 different states and 30 different bills to restrict voting based on the big lie, because of this belief that there is fraud, and so we have to stop it. Texas is probably the most extreme example. They will allow partisan poll workers to declare any ballot fraudulent. So those, after 2020, those calls that were made, can you find me 11,000 votes? Some of those calls will now be answered with, sure can. That's what Texas is going to allow us to do. They're closing polling locations. They're eliminating early voting. I don't even understand how they're going to make me show an ID by mail. Like, if I could mail anyway, right? It just defies logic. Several other states have really focused on the gerrymandering issue. Georgia, for example, right? I mean, we know that Biden won by a razor-thin margin there with those Senate seats. Their gerrymandering would make the state of Georgia a 64% likelihood for a Republican winner. Again, who is supporting these things? Wisconsin, which also went for Biden at a higher rate, would be a 75% chance Republican dominated, controlled, right? Just by the gerrymandering. Ohio, 80%, North Carolina, 70%. Again, all states that in some way went for Biden at thin margins are going to have these super majorities because the system is rigged. And thank goodness we have some different laws in Michigan. Michigan is being held up as an exemplar of the kinds of redistricting commissions and different things that we need to be doing. But it's absolutely right. You can't win the fair way. They're out there suppressing the vote, and they are out there gerrymandering the districts so that they will ensure that they will win.
We have a redistricting apocalypse taking place. There was a headline in the Washington Post the other day. Because after the census, now the states have the ability to redistrict. Some are required to because they've lost seats. And if Republicans control the legislature and the legislature controls the redistricting process, well, then they have fair game to do what they want to and rig the system.
Yeah, but so you mentioned Michigan as being a model, but how about the petition that's out there now that Republicans are trying to circulate and make it veto-proof? So that would severely limit people's access to the polls. Yeah,
we're no panacea to that as well. Like, those things are happening even in our own state, which has already passed. The Prop 3 to make ballot easier and no excuse absentee in Michigan, was the referendum, right? True direct democracy. This is so popular by people to be able to vote early, to vote by mail. So popular. That was like 80% of Michiganders voted for that. It's like a 2/3 of the population, right? So to think about what is truly the public purpose in those situations, it's so clear. Yet by controlling those rules, and continue to control those gerrymandered districts, Trump is absolutely looking at who's going to be running in those races and where can we place individuals across the country who will, again, I absolutely believe, give you those votes in 22 and 24.
So we have voter suppression laws taking place in a lot of states. These are laws that try to really, really restrict the ability of people to vote, and these are usually aimed at minority voters, right? Or young people. They're aimed at people that tend to vote Democratic more highly. And so they're trying to restrict and encumber and place obstacles and roadblocks and again, closing polling places, forcing long lines. So you have to be a marathoner to vote, right? Because
Right.
you got to be ready to stand there in line for 8 hours.
Right.
And Georgia, of course, even said, no, when you're standing in line, you can't be given food or water.
That's right.
What?
That is
What?
so ridiculous.
We want to force you to be a marathoner and stand in line, and we don't want to give you any food or water while you're there because we want you to go away.
That's
We
right.
don't want you to vote. I mean, that's the clear message.
Absolutely.
We don't want you to vote. Go away, go home. We've made it almost impossible for you to vote. And if you're hungry or thirsty, good, we want to get rid of you.
That's exactly right.
I mean, that's what these things are all about, right?
So what can we do? I mean, what that to me, the Democrats are being criticized now because they're not moving on this whole issue of voter suppression. But I think it's difficult for them to be able to do that, especially because of the razor-thin margins, but also because of the Supreme Court and what they can do. So we got to keep fighting on this, but it's tough. It's a tough fight.
Well, the obvious and earliest answer is, of course, folks other than us see this coming. The first bill introduced, H.R. 1, right, for the People Act, to address exactly those issues. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, those are real solutions to that. Of course, the conservatives are arguing that that's federalizing elections. No, it's guaranteeing your fundamental right to vote. It will still, elections will still continue to be administered by local officials, right? We have a true two-sovereign state, right? That will be absolutely recognized. But a federal provision for the People Act would outlaw gerrymandering. It would overhaul campaign finance. That's a big one. It would allow early voting, which, by the way, is already allowed in 43 states. This isn't, again, some crazy idea that no one's ever tried before. It would make no excuse absentee voting by mail, which is also already in 34 states. That's why they're trying to take it away. It would have automatic voter registration, much along the lines that we have had in Michigan for a long time, motor voter, right? So whenever you go to get any sort of other official ID, it just registers you automatically, right? So we do have bills that have been proposed to fix exactly this, but you're right, Don. Can they get out of the House and even through the Senate?
So let's just also provide a little historical context here, right? I mean, part of the problem here is that after the Civil War and the failure of Reconstruction, of course, then we entered into the Jim Crow era, right? And what we saw was just massive disenfranchisement of African American citizens. They could not vote. There were poll taxes, there were literacy tests, there were just violence directed against people who even attempted to register. And so this was just a massive campaign throughout the South to deny the right to vote, even though the Constitution and the 15th Amendment basically says this is a fundamental right of all citizens to vote. Southern states from the old Confederacy said, no, we will not let black people vote. And they did everything that they could, from violence to legal mechanisms to make sure that black people could not vote. And so that was the situation that we faced. Now, in 1965, the Congress of the United States finally got its act together and passed a Voting Rights Act.
That's right.
And Lyndon Johnson signed it into law. And that made a huge difference. That made a difference. Many more African Americans were able to register, which they'd never been able to do before, and then, of course, participate in the democratic process and be able to vote. And so this was a huge piece of legislation. It took the March in Selma, the Bloody Sunday incident, to really move Johnson, because the Democratic Party was very afraid of their Southern Democrats at the time, right? The Southern Democrats held the party in a stranglehold. This affected FDR during the New Deal. It affected Kennedy. It affected Johnson. And when Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, he basically said, well, we've lost the South to the Democrats for the next generation. And that was absolutely true. Richard Nixon's Southern strategy followed shortly thereafter, and those who had been conservative Democrats now became Republicans. So the South went from being solid Democratic to being solid Republican. But the Voting Rights Act was there, and it was enforced, and it made a huge difference. But now, we had a ruling by the Roberts Court.
Yeah,
Denise, you want to fill us in on that particular ruling and
Well,
how it undercut
Yeah,
the
so
Voting Rights
I
Act?
mean, the end of the day, right? That opinion says, well, it seems like we fixed all these problems. So we don't really need this kind of enforcement anymore, right?
It's over. They're
It's-
taking care of that.
It's
in those
already that's
states.
taken care of. That's an old issue, which is the similar argument here. Like, thank you, Ron, for that history, right? This is absolutely also racially motivated, and that's a big part of these last 30, 40 years of that history. And folks want to continue to say, not a problem, nothing to see here. That's not what's going on, and that's what the court essentially said. We don't need that federal protection anymore to make this happen. Unbelievable, right?
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
you see what happens in the aftermath of that. And you see states going crazy with
Doors.
18 laws, 18 states and,
And
30
no checks.
bills.
No checks on it.
And absolutely no checks on that, which is why we need to go back to that. It worked. If we really are going to care about democracy and our Constitution, it worked to have a federal provision.
And so H.R. 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act are attempts to restore
That's right.
the 1965 Voting Rights
That's
Act,
right.
essentially.
That's right.
Right.
And to deal with this onslaught of efforts to deny people the right to participate in our democratic process.
That's right.
And that's what's happening. The Republican Party is a systematic effort to deny people the right to vote, to participate in the democratic process. This is why
Yeah.
we're trying to raise the alarm. Our democracy is threatened.
Yes.
We could have a one-party stranglehold over every institution
That's
of
right.
government in this society.
Yeah.
And again, if that was based on fair and free elections, well, that's the way it works, right?
That's right.
If your policies are more popular and you get the most votes, well, fine. But that's not what's happening here. It's not a matter of, hey, here are our policies, vote for us because this
That's
is
right.
what we're going
No.
to do for you. That's not what's happening.
No.
That's not happening at all. In fact, all the policies of the Republican Party, or the vast majority of the policies of the Republican Party, are rejected by
That's
the
right.
American
That's right.
people. Poll after poll after poll
That's right.
shows that what they're about is rejected. The people want a
They
lot
do.
of the things that are being proposed, the bills that are moving through Congress
Yes.
right now, the infrastructure
That's
bill,
right.
the Build Back Better
That's right.
bill, which just got approved by the House
Yep.
of Representatives this morning.
Yep.
Those things are extremely popular,
Yeah.
and Republicans simply can't compete on that turf. And so, because they can't compete on the basis of ideas and popularity and attracting votes, they resort to rigging the system to ensure their own political power. I think we have to just put that out as
Absolutely.
strongly as possible.
Oh, yeah.
This is a rigging of the system,
That's
and
right.
it's a threat to American democracy.
That's right.
And I think we also have to put out there that the fundamental requirement of a democracy is an informed public.
Yes.
And the misinformation that has been
Yeah.
so successfully put out there, and I think that's the other piece of it. It's the legislation that's going on in the states, but it's also the terrible misinformation thing that's going on.
And that's part of the big lie.
That's right.
I mean,
Yeah,
the big lie is
absolutely.
just how can something that is so false, so
Yeah.
untrue, continue to have the legs that it does?
That's right.
It continues to be echoed on Fox News and other
Yep.
media sources, and it's not challenged effectively enough by the mainstream media,
No.
and it's not effectively challenged as much as it should be by the Democratic Party, for gosh sakes.
No.
And so the big lie lives, the big lie has this effect.
Yep.
And so we've talked about voter suppression tactics, we've talked about the redistricting apocalypse, but Denise, I want to talk about one other thing that's happening, and that is, in some of these states, what they're also attempting to do is to give the legislature the power to override what the
Yes.
voting officials decide. And so if a vote is held and a Republican loses,
Yep.
all they have to do is make a false claim of fraud. The legislature can step in and override it and say, oh yeah, we agree there was fraud. We're going to put our guy in. Our guy didn't get the most votes. Our person didn't get the most votes, but we're going to put that person in anyhow because of some false claim of fraud, and we're going to
That's right.
override everything that was done in this fair and free election, and we're going to impose our will.
Yep.
How can you get any more undemocratic than that?
That's
And that's what's happening, isn't it?
That's exactly what's happening, and that's why I do think it's correct to say Bill Maher calls it a slow-moving coup. It's like we're not even awake, right, to the idea that that's exactly the mechanisms that are being put in place so that, again, in 22 and 24, you've got your folks in place who are ready to overturn and find those votes for you. And that's exactly what they're doing. And that these things are against the public's just majority will, but would negate one person, one vote, which has been the Supreme Court and the constitutional standard our entire democracy.
Yeah.
It's just unbelievable that anyone could support taking away your voice like that. But that's what's being put in place, again, so that they know they can't win, so that they absolutely can take it over by other means. And the fraud claims, one other thing I was reading, it's about as likely as me being struck twice by lightning, like today. That's how, right? It just doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Doesn't exist. Yet everything is predicated on that falsehood in order to get those folks who believe that, well, now we can utilize you so that I can stay in power.
I just think about in Georgia,
Yeah.
how that guy stood up
Yes.
against
Thank goodness.
Trump. But that's eliminated. He
That's
would
right.
not have that option. We would not have that guy in the middle there to
right.
stop that. Yeah,
He's-
terrible.
Trump and the Trump loyalists are going to make sure that there's no one in any state left who would actually stand up for voting rights.
Right.
That's what they're doing with these mechanisms, right? So again, he will be able to make that call and say, looks like we need a different result here.
Republican legislatures have now put into place mechanisms by which they make the decision.
That's right.
Not the people.
Yeah.
Not the voters. Doesn't matter.
That's
You
right.
can vote, you can have 80% vote for this candidate. If the Republican legislature says, oh, there was fraud there, completely with no basis whatsoever, no real evidence, no court decision about that.
Nope.
As long as the fraud claim is raised, the legislature can impose itself and insert its will. So Republican legislatures have put themselves in place to decide who gets elected and who doesn't, not the people of the
That's
United
right.
States.
That's right.
That's right.
And I'm so glad you brought up the whole Reconstruction era, because this is really us continuing to live out that history.
Right.
And it's not just that the Republican Party is comfortable pushing this idea of rigging elections. They're also pretty darn comfortable with violence again, in order to stop that vote or to make sure that their proxies get into these particular seats, right? That those two things alone, right? That your party now stands for rigging elections and for violence.
Right.
Come on.
And intimidation.
Exactly.
And scare
We're right
you.
back.
Yeah. Because we can check up that. This might be against the law, what you're doing, and you might have to go to jail for this. Yeah.
And this is where the poll watchers come in.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because the poll watchers are there to intimidate.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's what the Republican poll watchers are not there to be observers to make sure everything is fair and free. They're there to intimidate certain people from voting and to raise objections and to try to raise these issues of fraud, which are non-existent for the most part. And yet that's their role. And they've strengthened the role of these poll watchers to make those challenges, to engage in intimidation of election officials as well as intimidation of potential voters, right?
Yes.
That's what
right.
they're there
Yes.
for.
That's
And,
right.
and they tried to do that, of course, in the 2020 election.
Right.
Poll watchers tried to do whatever they could. Often the poll watchers didn't understand the process at all, and they kept raising alarms about things that were, absolutely valid
Right.
procedures for
Yeah.
running an election because they were so uninformed
Yep.
that they were there only to do one thing and intimidate, and they didn't even understand the system.
That's right.
So they raised all these false claims. So we saw that, but now that's going to happen in spades come
That's right.
2022
That's
and
right.
2024.
Yeah, right. It's just, people have been reluctant to vote. Black people have been reluctant to vote before. But then there was this change and people did go to the polls.
That's right.
And now there's this intimidation again and just driving them away.
Yeah.
I have to give credit to Stephanie Williams and the Mothers of Hope in Kalamazoo for the efforts that they have done to get people registered to vote and get them to the polls. Even in the recent election,
That's right.
where only 19% of registered voters voted, Mothers of Hope were at the polls with food, with music, getting people out there to vote. They're doing a great service to this community.
I want to inject one thing here. there are many, many Republicans who are not on board with this. There are many good Republicans who do not want this to happen, who are just as appalled by this as we are. There are many, I want to make that very clear, there are many Republicans who are appalled at this process, but they are losing control of their party.
Yes.
The Trump faction has taken over their party.
Yep.
And so those people, good Republicans concerned about these issues, civic-minded, are being driven out of their party, or they're being silenced, or they're being challenged in primaries and voted out, or they're succumbing to the pressure and just going along to get along. And that's another part of the tragedy here, is that good folks can be so intimidated or driven out of their own party as to lose control over this process. And one extremist faction has been able to totally capture the Republican Party.
And they're threatened, physically
Absolutely.
threatened, and their families are threatened.
Well, let's our own Congressman
Fred
Upton.
Upton.
I mean,
right.
I mean, and most people probably know this story, but when the infrastructure bill,
Right.
which was a bipartisan bill,
Yes.
there were many, many Republicans in the Senate
That's
who
right.
who helped to craft this, and Mitch McConnell himself supported
correct.
it. It was a bipartisan vote in the Senate. The bill went to the House. And this is how extreme our politics have become.
Yeah.
Once it got in the House and once it became clear that it had a chance to pass, then the word came down from the Trumpist and Kevin McCarthy, you can't vote for this. It's a bipartisan bill. Many Republican senators voted for it.
Yeah.
But in the House, you were not supposed to do this.
That's
right? Well, there were brave Republicans who 13 of them, Fred Upton was one of them, who said, this is a bipartisan bill, this is a good bill, this is going to help Michigan, this is going to help our state, this is going to help my constituents, I'm going to vote for it. And so Fred did vote for it, and then Fred was subjected to
terrible
these
threats.
Absolutely.
death threats to him and his family and his staff.
Yeah. Well, let me offer an alternative view. So what we all should be doing, to your question, I hope you have written your thank you note to Mitch McConnell and to Fred Upton. It pains me to say that in some ways, right?
Fred.
But those Republicans that did vote for this, the rest of us that understand this, that I disagree with almost everything else they might have ever done, boy, you better show them
That's right.
that this was the right thing to do. And I sent my thank yous to Representative Upton, and on the other side of that, I've also, disagreed with almost, again, everything Representative Upton has ever done. I've sent him a lot of postcards and emails and phone calls over the year, and never once have I called him anything other than the honorable representative from my 6th congressional district, and been coherent and pleasant, right? And not call him names or threaten his family for doing things that I disagreed with. The tenor, right, of this is what I mean about the violence, the vigilantism strain in that part of the party, to say, that's okay. You know what? You don't like what they did, you can go right to violence. And, again, how many comments have we sent, Don, over these years?
Yeah, but
I've never said anything like that to people that I absolutely have nothing to good
we have
policy
certainly
about.
criticized Fred on this program
Exactly.
many times.
But I totally agree. I sent him a letter right away saying thank you for your courage and your wisdom in taking a stand on this, and it helps our people.
Yes.
And
And Liz Cheney and
Liz Cheney,
the House committee that's investigating the attempted coup on January 6th.
That's right.
I mean, I probably couldn't agree less with somebody than Liz Cheney on most issues, but on this issue, she has been extremely strong and extremely articulate. And if she wasn't there speaking out as she is, this would not be moving forward as it is. Adam Kinzinger is another, although now he's not going to run. I mean, he sees the handwriting on the wall. There's no way I can survive in a Trumpist party, and so I'm not going to run. And so we're losing a very good representative. The people of Illinois in that district are going to lose a very good congressperson because he's been, in a sense, driven out of the party.
Absolutely.
Right.
And the Wyoming Republicans came out the other day and said, we don't recognize Liz Cheney as a Republican. Well, she's not a Trump Republican, and if that's your definition of Republican in these days. I mean, my dad was a Republican. I think my dad is rolling in his grave, and he looks at what's happening to the political party that he supported most of his life. And I think back to, the Hatfield-McGovern Amendment. You know, one of my first political activities was to march and try to get signatures for the Hatfield-McGovern Amendment. A Republican, Mark Hatfield, and a Democrat, George McGovern, who came together to try to cut off funding for the war in Vietnam. There were many Republicans like that. Jacob Javits, and you know, the list could go on and on. Hugh Scott from Pennsylvania. There were many, you know, James Baker during the Watergate hearings. Howard Baker. The Watergate hearings. I greatly admired Howard Baker for the way he handled the Watergate hearings. And to see this particular political, and we need to have two strong political parties. We probably need 5 or 6 good strong political parties, but at least in the American context, when we only have 2, we've got to have a Republican Party representing, I mean, and again, you can be a good conservative and you can argue conservative positions, raise questions about the role of government in society, and we can have good debates about those issues and clashing philosophies about the proper role of government and the private sector and a whole bunch of other things. But that's not what the Trump Party's about. No. That's not what the Republican Party has become under Donald Trump, and it's becoming this extremist faction, and it's driving away very good people from public service who have been on the Republican side.
And it's killing democracy, as we started off talking about. That's what democracy should be about, where we disagree with each other, but put our ideas out there.
That's right.
Absolutely.
That's right. That's why it is the 5-alarm fire that you talked about. So again, who is being driven out? Anyone with a reasonable view, or who is being left? The most extremist, vigilante rigging of elections folks that are left, because they will do anything to keep their own power.
Yeah, it's really disheartening, to say the least, right now, the political situation that we encounter in the United States.
I mean, think about Rep. Paul Gosar, right? Bring the video. Oh my goodness, right? I mean, you can make, I don't know about you, but I think even Western Michigan University would probably have something to say if I made a video of me killing someone else. My goodness.
I think so.
Right? Most of us would probably lose our job if we did something like that. And we're barely going to be able to censor him. And of course, Trump loyalists, including McCarthy, have come to the defense and, you know, oh, I can't wait to get you back on committees and support that. It's just ridiculous, right? That's not acceptable.
No,
not acceptable at all. There's a couple of other issues I want us to talk about, and since we already raised it, let's go back to the HR 1 and the John Lewis Act, and so my take on this. So right now, when we're looking at the infrastructure bill and we're looking at the Build Back Better bill. The Democrats are going to be able to pass that if they can keep the Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema on board, right? Because these are budgetary related issues, they can be done under a process called reconciliation, and they can't be filibustered, right? And so with a 50-50 Senate, if all 50 Democratic senators vote and then Kamala Harris breaks the tie, the bill passes, right? Okay. That's not the case with these, the voting rights stuff.
That's right.
There, a filibuster would be allowed and is almost certain to happen. I mean, the Republicans right now in the Senate are not going to allow these bills to pass. And so the only way these pieces of legislation can pass is if the Democrats decide to bite the bullet and end the filibuster.
Right.
Any chance of that?
It's a big one. It's a big one, but I think the stakes are that high that they need to do it. I think so. Yeah, I mean, you know, there'll be retaliation, and it'll cost them in the next one, but the voting right thing is so fundamental.
That's right.
It just seems to me that if we're going to talk about what this country is supposed to be about and fairness and justice, it just seems to me they have to do it.
Yeah. We've seen more and more elected officials in Congress move towards that position and say that the filibuster is part of the problem. And it's also, right, a whole holdback of ideas about why we even have
it's not
this
in the
mechanism,
Constitution.
Right, is for many other reasons not great, right? So this idea that we would continue to keep this hurdle I mean, even a Joe Manchin has said, well, maybe at least like you still got to talk like the old movies, right?
Right.
You still have to do that. So I think that there'll be some movement. I do on at least re-engaging on some requirements for the filibuster to at least make you own it and make it difficult. Standing in that voting line without food and water, make you stand there and speak until we're done without food and water or going to the bathroom. Good luck.
Can't just call it in.
They can't just call it in anymore. That has just become a ridiculous pro forma routine that, oh, no, we don't get to talk about that. So I think there's a lot of support for putting back some of those requirements. And I think a lot more elected officials than we know are really going to consider the filibuster. But then, if you take it away now, when you have a 51 majority, barely, of course, what's going to happen the next time around, right? But I agree with you, Don. I think the stakes are too high. If we don't get the vote right, I mean, you've run enough elections to know it is all about voter turnout. Turnout is what every election is about. And if we don't allow people to actually vote, right? If we fix the voting issue and stop the suppression, then folks are able actually to vote their preferences, their true preferences in 22 and 24, then we wouldn't have to worry so much about that retaliation.
That's
is
right.
the sort of long game
That's
way
right.
to think about it, right? But of course, we've seen this before when we changed, for example, Senate rules to confirm justices. And then that seesaw effect, right? Then whoever is in power uses it maliciously. And so that's a big risk. And I think it's worth it. I think a lot more of Congress is starting to see that same message.
And I think that black constituents are demanding it. I think that they are saying, we put you in power.
That's right.
And this is the thing that we want most of all. I believe, anyhow. That's my judgment.
Yeah.
Biden would not have won without their support. And now this is the payback that they were asking.
And Biden himself has been reluctant to pick up the cause here on the filibuster, let alone Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema.
Oh, yeah.
And Joe Manchin keeps talking about, well, we can find 10 good Republicans over there to support this. We can have compromises. We can have bipartisan legislation. And I mean, I think, if he's got his eyes wide open and he's looking at what's been happening in the process up to this point, there aren't 10 Republicans over there that are going to support anything.
No.
And again, let's just go back to the infrastructure bill. I mean, in the Senate, you were able to get enough Republicans to get that through, building bridges and roads, and brought internet connections for people in rural area.
That helps their district.
Exactly.
That should be pretty stuff that we could pretty much agree on.
Popular measures.
But why did so many Republicans vote against it in the House? Well, it was plain and simple, because this is going to benefit Joe Biden.
Yes.
Even though it's going to help our people, help our constituents, we can't do this. We can't do anything to improve the lives of our own people because it gives Joe Biden a victory. And this is a zero-sum game, right? Anything Biden wins, we lose. This is a fight to the death, and so we have to block anything Joe Biden wants to do, no matter how good it is for our own people.
That's right.
And of course, as soon as the vote passes, as soon as the infrastructure bill passes, some of the same Republican congressmen who voted against it then go back to their districts and, isn't this great? We have this infrastructure bill. You're going to benefit so much. Yeah, but you voted against it.
That's right. There are some calls for us to change how we allocate those fundings and say, you know what, if your representative didn't vote for it, your district doesn't get the funding, right? But of course, that comes through the states rather than all the different. But there's some folks calling for that, like you don't get to claim this, right? And that Democrats have a really big messaging thing to play here and say, no, that was because of us and the things that we did. But if you're really playing the long game that you laid out, Ron, earlier, that the Republicans are playing to take over democracy, all you got to do is sit tight and hang on and vote against everything, because again, you're stacking the deck in every other way that you can. And if you win on those things, the rigging the elections and the violence and the intimidation, that 2022 will come and you'll win just fine. You won't even have to worry about this stuff. And then it can all be your credit. So it is pure base politic right now. Absolutely. It's not even just about go Brandon go, right? It's not even just about that. It's about this longer, slow-moving coup and making sure they've been much better at playing the long game for many, many years, and that's exactly what they're doing here.
Yes.
Well, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I did want to also pick up one other issue. And of course, we just had the off-year elections, and the Virginia governor race was really people concentrated on that a lot.
Yeah.
And of course, the Democratic candidate lost to the Republican candidate, and the mainstream media and political commentators went crazy. This shows people are rejecting Biden and they're rejecting the Democratic's message, and the fact that McAuliffe was a conservative Democrat, ran a horrible campaign and basically botched the election about every way possible. That doesn't take into account, and of course there were plenty of other progressive wins all around the country that sort of belie the fact that the concentration on this one particular race. So the overreaction on the part of the media is one thing, and the calls then, okay, the Democratic Party's got to move to the right, they got to at least move to the center, right? And of course, all the evidence, all the polling evidence completely belies that, right? All the things that the Democrats are trying to do in their bills are extremely popular, widely supported, even among Republican voters, and so that's not the message here. But that's the message that you get from the mainstream media. So that's one issue. Now, the other issue, though, is one of the things that the Republican candidate in Virginia did is to very effectively use the culture war. In particular, the issue about schools and who controls schools and critical race theory. Now, again, these are racist dog whistles, right? I mean, to criticize critical race theory is a racist dog whistle. Sure. You can't come right out and say, vote for me because I'm going to put down black people. But basically, by opposing critical race theory, you're sending out that same message. Is that a fair assessment? Or am I
no question about it. Right. Because nobody's teaching critical race theory.
Right.
It's not being taught at
the postgraduate level.
Much like voter fraud.
Yeah,
it doesn't even exist.
It doesn't even exist.
So, I mean, the real issue is, do we want to teach kids history?
That's right.
Do we want them to know what's going before?
That's right.
Now, I teach a history course, a history of social welfare, which ends up being a history of the country. And when I spent a lot of time on the civil rights movement. And when I do that, I ask the students, did you guys study this in high school? No, a little bit, not much. They know very little about it at all. So, I mean, we're not teaching the history.
That's right.
But if we want, our young people deserve this. They deserve to know what happened in this country and what is the heritage of that and where are we today. And this is what these people don't want to see happen.
That's right. They much rather stick to the version of history that is taught, which is a whitewashed, scrubbed clean of any dissent or protest or uprisings that were successful in gaining other people's rights. And even folks look back and say, oh yeah, well, Martin Luther King, sure, now we can accept that.
But piece of Martin Luther King.
That's right. Oh, but only these up
to 1965, the March on Washington. Which was great and wonderful, but we don't want to talk about the last 3 years of his life when he talked about.
I don't want them to have to wait to college. I grew up in a very conservative small town in Iowa, and I got to tell you, I had the same experience. When I moved away and went to college, I was like, what? I mean, I didn't get taught things about the Civil War that were common knowledge to other educated people, and I was at a disadvantage because of those things, right? And that absolutely fed into the culture in those small towns and in those echo chambers, as you were talking about. They talk to the same people, you're watching the same media, you've got no alternative history that you've ever even read, right? And we know that is the history of America, and we could be celebrating that.
That's right.
And could go a long ways to reconciling Reconstruction and the issues that Ron always brings up. I mean, required reading, I don't know, Howard Zinn. What do you think? It's like 7th grade, maybe? Is that too young? Something like that would work?
No, I don't think so. Yeah.
Well, and again, this is part of a very long strategy of using cultural issues to divide the working class, and now even to divide the middle class, right? Divide and conquer, right? If the working class is united, they're going to vote their interest, their economic interest, which would be to vote for the Democratic Party policies for the most part, not the Republican Party policies, which are the policies of the corporations and the wealthy, right, in terms of economic issues. And so you have to divide. You've got to peel off the white working class and get them all afraid about black people making economic
That's right.
gains, which will threaten their economic status, and therefore they'll support the Republican Party and not the Democratic Party. That's what it's all about, right?
Oldest political trick in the book: get them to
Divide
fight
and-
each other,
divide and
rather than to
conquer.
fight
Divide and
you.
conquer.
And that's what they're doing. Actually, there used to be a great bumper sticker in the '80s that just said this well, and it was like, "Vote your tax bracket." Is what it said, and it just always reminds me of that.
And it was successful in Virginia. It was
Well,
very
you raised a really important point. Candidates do still matter, and McAuliffe, right, did a lot of things that were not going to ensure election success when we're in the midst of a crisis in democracy and a massive culture wars and the most extreme partisan ideology we've experienced, right, and at least since the birth of this nation. So candidates do still matter,
Yeah,
and so I
they
think
do.
that we could see that as a good thing as well, right? And so we got to make sure on the Democratic side that folks are putting up candidates that can speak about these things, that can do so articulately and speak to people and reunite
Right.
those coalitions. That's going to be huge as folks try to run for 22.
Because McAuliffe lost a lot of the white middle class females
That's right.
who voted for Biden.
Yep.
I mean, Virginia was trending Democratic. A lot of these middle class women were very upset with Trump. They tended to go. Traditionally, they had been Republican voters, but they voted for Biden in 2020. But McAuliffe lost them. And the culture war, the fact of controlling my local education
Right.
Right.
was a big factor.
Yeah, and he made that one statement about we don't want the parents interfering in the schools.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
that's disaster right there.
So we're going to see a replay of this in 2022,
That's right.
Everywhere. Critical race theory will not go away. This effort to divide and conquer, this effort to use the culture war. So on top of all the other things that they're doing, this is another tactic, strategy of the Republican Party to use the culture war to divide voters and to sway white middle class and white working class voters away from the Democratic Party, when it would be to their economic interest to vote for that party.
That's right.
But they're often convinced to vote for Republicans because of those fears
That's right.
that the culture wars raise. Well, we're just about out of time. Any quick announcements from you two in the last minute of the program here? Anything the Climate Crisis Coalition is doing, or anything from the city?
Well, I would say we are very much looking forward to having Don back as vice mayor and walking us back through Jamie McCarthy, our sustainable development coordinator, finishing a sustainability plan, and I can't wait to see that be coming up in
too.
December.
Yeah.
It has some really great pieces in it for climate, for homes, to meet the trifecta, right? This is about, we can solve, as you said, as you started the show, Don, we can solve these problems right here, and we
Yeah.
can be a model for those things that deal with economics and safety and environment.
That's right.
That's what this plan is all about, and I'm looking forward to that, so
Me too.
be part of that.
Me too.
All right. I want to give a shout out to our great crew, our director, Daniel Smith, Larry Mahannah, and Bob Kildea back there spinning the dials, helping to make this show possible, and John Provancher, our great floor manager here, who keeps us on task and up to speed on the time. And Johnny, you telling me it's time to wrap up? Okay, so we'll wrap up. Thank you for visiting us here on Critical Issues, Alternative Views. We hope you come back and see us again. Thank you.